Louis Rabiot fired the 75th nanny at 3 a.m., not with a raised voice, not with a threat. He simply opened the door of his Mediterranean estate and said nothing, and the woman ran without being told twice. In the nursery down the hall, his 7-year-old son Leo lay with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. He had been staring at the ceiling for 11 days, not sleeping, barely eating, just waiting for something no doctor could name and no amount of money had been able to buy. Louis had spent $4.2 million trying. Pediatric neurologists from Zurich, sleep specialists flown in from Tokyo, a private ward at the most exclusive clinic in Monaco. Every expert said the same thing, in different languages, with the same carefully professional expression. Physically, he is fine. Physically. As if Louis didn't know the difference between a boy who was sick and a boy who was breaking. As if he hadn't watched Leo's laughter disappear month by month, slowly, the way a fire goes out. Not all at once, but ember by ember, until one night you look and realize the room has been cold for a long time. Louis Rabiot's name was spoken in whispers in 4 countries, and with fear in 12 others. He could not make his son sleep. He walked the halls of his mansion at 4 a.m., 12,000 square feet of marble and silence, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt the specific terror of a man who has run out of moves. Then, 3 days later, in a rain-soaked shopping mall on the outskirts of the city, he heard her. He didn't see her first. He felt her. A sound that cut through the noise of the crowd like a hand pressed flat against his chest. Warm, low, unhurried. A melody that didn't perform. It simply was. The way breathing is. The way a heartbeat is. He stopped walking. Around him, people moved and talked and checked their phones. Nobody else seemed to notice. But Louis Rabiot stood completely still in the middle of a shopping mall for the first time in his life, because something in the frequency of that voice reached past every wall he had ever built and touched something he thought had calcified years ago. He found her 20 meters away. She was standing beside a flower stall, singing to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone. In a paint-stained apron over a red dress, her curly hair damp from the rain, a small donation tin at her feet with almost nothing in it. No stage, no microphone, no performance, just a woman with a voice that sounded like the first night of real sleep after a very long war. She looked up and found him staring. She didn't look away. Most people looked away from Louis Rabiot. He crossed the distance between them in 8 seconds. His head of security moved to flank him. He raised one hand, "Stay back." And the men froze. He stopped in front of her. She was still looking at him, not afraid, not impressed, just present, the way very few people ever were in his company. He reached into his jacket, took out his phone, and transferred $3.5 million into the account number she hadn't given him yet. "I'll need your details," he said, "but the money is already yours." She stared at the notification that appeared on her own phone, then back at him. "My son," Louis said, "has not slept in 11 days. 70 people have failed him. I have failed him." He said the last 3 words the way a man says them when they are the hardest 3 words he has ever spoken. "You are going to come to my home tonight. You are going to sing to him. And if you can give him 1 hour of peace," he paused, "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never want for anything again." She looked at the money. She looked at him, at the dark suit, the tattooed knuckles, the face of a man who had clearly never begged for anything and was, in this moment, doing something close to it. "And if I say no?" she asked. Louis was quiet for a moment. "You won't," he said. Not a threat, just the quiet certainty of a man who had heard her voice and already understood, on some cellular, wordless level, Why, that she was the thing his house had been missing. Not just for his son, but for everything. He was right. She didn't say no. What she didn't know yet was that the moment she walked through his gates, she wouldn't just be saving a little boy from insomnia. She would be walking into the center of a war and into the life of a man who did not yet know the difference between claiming something and deserving it. She was about to teach him. Hit that subscribe button right now before we begin, so you don't miss more stories like this. The notification sat on her screen like something from a dream she hadn't earned. Catherine Ardell stared at the number, then at the man, then at the number again. $3.5 million, transferred from an account she didn't recognize, into a bank that had once sent her an automated warning for a negative balance of $47. The timestamp read 4:13 p.m. The mall hummed around them. A child somewhere behind her was crying over a dropped ice cream cone, and the world was continuing at its ordinary pace, as though the ground had not just shifted entirely beneath her feet. She looked up at him. He was still watching her with that expression. Not impatience, not urgency, but something quieter and more unsettling. The look of a man who had already decided and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "I know what I heard." He said it simply, without decoration, the way people state things that are simply true. "That is enough for now." She searched his face for the shape of a scam, and for the particular shine of desperation that made men dangerous. She found neither. What she found instead was exhaustion. Deep, structural exhaustion, the kind that lives in the bones rather than the eyes. And beneath it, something that looked startlingly like grief. He was not a man performing power. He was a man who had power in abundance and had discovered too late the specific things it could not touch. "My name is Catherine," she said finally. "I know." He didn't explain how. "My car is outside. We leave in 10 minutes, if that is enough time for you to arrange whatever needs arranging." It was not a question. But it was also, she noticed, not quite a command. There was a hairline fracture in his certainty, small enough that he probably didn't know it was visible, and large enough that she could see he was not entirely sure she would say yes. That fracture was the thing that made her step forward instead of back. She had one call to make, her landlord, to say she would be away. He didn't ask where, he never did. The car was black and long and silent, and the man who held the door open for her did not look at her face. Inside, Louis sat across from her, with his forearms resting on his knees, and for a long stretch of motorway, neither of them spoke. The city peeled away outside the tinted windows, the crowded streets, the loud, familiar disorder of ordinary life, and gave way to coast road, to cliffs, to iron gates at the end of a private drive that seemed to go on longer than was strictly necessary. The estate materialized out of the evening like something from a country that had different rules. Catherine had imagined wealth before, in the abstract way people do when they are counting coins at a checkout. She had not imagined this, not the scale of it, not the silence of it, not the way it felt less like a home and more like a held breath, beautiful and cold and waiting for something to make it exhale. She followed Louis through an entrance hall where two men in dark clothing tracked her passage with their eyes, but did not speak. She noticed the way the staff adjusted their posture when Louis moved through a room, the way the air itself seemed to reorganize around him. She noticed, too, the way his gaze swept the staircase as they entered, quickly, automatically, toward the upper floor, toward wherever his son was. He stopped at the base of the stairs and turned to her. "There are rooms prepared," he said. "Anything you need will be brought to you." He paused, and something shifted in the architecture of his expression. Some controlled dismantling that she sensed cost him considerably. His name is Leo. He is 7. He is—" Another pause. Longer. "He's a very good boy. He's just very tired, and he cannot find his way to rest." She understood in that moment that she was not being briefed. She was being trusted by a man who almost certainly did not trust easily, or often, or without significant cost to himself. "I'd like to see him now," she said, "before he's asleep, before anything else." Louis studied her. Then he nodded once and turned toward the staircase, and she followed him up through the hush of that enormous house, past portraits and closed doors and the particular quiet of a place where joy had been absent long enough to leave an outline on the walls. At the end of the corridor, he paused outside a door. He didn't open it. He simply looked at it for a moment, the way a man looks at the one thing in the world he cannot afford to lose. Then he stepped aside and let her through. The room was not what she expected. She had braced herself for the sterile precision of the rest of the house, the marble, the controlled elegance, the sense that every surface had been curated by someone who understood beauty but had forgotten warmth. Instead, Leo's room was an island. Someone had tried very hard in here. There were stars painted on the ceiling in pale gold, visible even in the low light, shelves of books with cracked spines, a worn stuffed rabbit on the windowsill that was clearly loved rather than decorative. Small shoes lined up by the door with the careful deliberateness of a child who had been taught to be orderly and actually listened. And in the center of it all, in a bed that was slightly too large for him, Leo. He lay on his back with his eyes open, the way Catherine had heard drowning people sometimes float, present and not present at once, caught in something between states. He was small for 7, pale in the way that spoke not of illness, but of too many weeks without real sunlight, without the particular kind of tiredness that came from running and shouting and living at full volume the way children were supposed to. His eyes moved to her when she entered. Dark, like his father's. Watchful. He did not speak. She crossed the room without hurrying and sat on the edge of the bed, not too close, leaving him the dignity of his own space. She looked at him the way she looked at most things, directly, without performance. "My name is Catherine," she said. "I'm not a doctor. I'm not here to fix anything." She glanced at the rabbit on the windowsill. "Is that yours?" A beat, then the smallest nod. "What's his name?" Another pause, longer, then, barely above a breath. "Bo. Bo," she repeated, as though it were a perfectly serious and important name, because it was. "Has Bo been sleeping?" Something moved across the boy's face, not quite a smile, the memory of one, perhaps. He shook his head. "Well," Catherine said, settling back slightly, making herself unhurried, "I'm making the room feel safe by refusing to be anxious in it. Maybe we can help him." She didn't announce what she was going to do. She didn't ask permission or make a ceremony of it. She simply let the silence breathe for a moment, and then she began. It wasn't a lullaby in any formal sense. It was the song she sang when she was alone, the one that had no particular origin she could name, that had simply always lived somewhere low in her chest and came out when the world needed softening. A melody more felt than heard, unhurried, without climax or resolution, cycling gently like a tide coming in. She watched Leo's face. It happened the way dawn happens, not in a single moment, but in a series of small surrenders. The tightness around his eyes loosened first. Then his hands, which had been closed against the blanket, opened slowly, and the fingers uncurling one by one. His breathing, which had been shallow and quick, deepened without effort, without anyone asking it to. His chest rose and fell with new authority. His eyelids grew heavy, fought the weight for one long moment. And then, quietly, without drama, without the desperate collapse she imagined 70 failed nannies had witnessed and misread as progress, He simply let go. Leo slept. Not fitfully, not briefly. He slept the way the very young are supposed to sleep, with the whole body committed, with the face, finally, completely, at rest. Catherine sat with him a while longer, letting the song taper into quiet, the way you let a hand remain a moment after a hug ends. Then she stood, smoothed the blanket once at the edge without touching him, and turned toward the door. Louis was in the doorway. She didn't know how long he had been there. Long enough, she thought. He was very still, a quality she was coming to understand was unusual for a man his size. And he was looking not at his son, but at something in the middle distance, his jaw set in the particular way of someone managing an emotion they had not expected and were not sure they were entitled to feel. She stepped into the corridor and pulled the door gently closed behind her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. When Louis finally looked at her, something in his expression had shifted, almost imperceptibly, the way the light changes when a cloud moves. The assessment was still there, but beneath it, something had given way. Something old and load-bearing that had been holding too long and had chosen this moment, this corridor, this woman in a paint-stained apron, on to finally release. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. She could see it in the steadiness of the breath he drew. Slow, full, the first unstrained breath she suspected he had taken in a very long time. He looked, for just one unguarded moment, like a man who had forgotten what it felt like to not be afraid. She slept better than she had in years. That was the first thing she noticed when she woke. The quality of the silence, the weight of the linen, the particular stillness of a room that had never known noise or worry, or the thin-walled anxiety of her apartment, where the pipes spoke at all hours, and the street below never fully quieted. She lay for a moment in the unfamiliar luxury of it, staring at a ceiling that was simply a ceiling, and not a map of water stains she had named and memorized out of sleepless habit. Then she remembered where she was, and she sat up. Morning had come in clean and bright through curtains that someone had drawn while she slept. On the dresser, she found her clothes from the previous day, folded with a precision that embarrassed them slightly, and beside them, a breakfast tray she hadn't asked for. Coffee, fruit, bread still faintly warm. She ate standing, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned not to linger in spaces that didn't belong to her. She had things to do. Real things, ordinary things, the small structural business of a life that had continued existing in her absence. Her neighbor was holding a package. She had a phone call to return, an appointment she had said she would reschedule and not yet rescheduled. The world outside these gates had not paused simply because she had stepped through them. She gathered her bag, her jacket, her sense of herself, and went downstairs. The house was quieter in the morning than it had been the night before, a different kind of quiet, less held, more natural. Through a doorway she passed, she heard the distant sound of a child's voice, low and unhurried, and something in her chest eased to know that Leo was awake and speaking rather than lying in that pale, untethered silence. She kept walking. The entrance hall, the front door, large and dark and solid, with iron hardware that looked like it had opinions. She reached for the handle. "Where are you going?" It was not a question. Questions had a particular shape, an upward tilt at the end, that acknowledged the possibility of an answer that hadn't yet been determined. This had no such tilt. This was a sentence that had already decided. She turned. Louis stood at the base of the staircase in a dark shirt, sleeves folded to the forearm, looking as though he had been awake for some time and had spent the hours doing something other than resting. He looked, she thought, like a man who had slept, truly slept, and found the experience had not made him soft, but rather more certain. "Home," she said. Briefly. I have things to attend to. He crossed the entrance hall with a measured, unhurried pace that nonetheless covered the distance faster than seemed reasonable, and then he was between her and the door. Not dramatically. Not with any visible aggression. Simply there, not in the way a wall is there, without apology, without negotiation. That isn't possible today, he said. She felt the first clean spark of something that was not quite anger, but was its immediate neighbor. She kept her voice level. I wasn't asking for a schedule review. I'm telling you I need to leave for a few hours. I'll come back this evening. You'll come back. He repeated it the way people repeat things they find faintly implausible. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. Behind them, somewhere above, she heard Leo's voice again, and she watched Louis's gaze move briefly toward the sound. Involuntary, automatic, the instinct of a man whose entire nervous system had reorganized itself around one small person. He asked for you this morning, Louis said, before he asked for breakfast, before he asked for anything, a beat. That has not happened, with anyone. She softened slightly against her better judgment. I understand that, and I'll be back. But I am not your employee on call, and I am not. You gave him something last night that 70 people before you could not. His voice was quiet, but it had a quality like pressure, steady, increasing, difficult to stand against without planting your feet. He slept 7 hours. 7. I stood outside his door at 2 a.m, and I listened to him breathe, and he was breathing the way he used to. Before. He stopped. The word before carried considerable weight that he did not unpack. You've given him life. You don't get to take it away now. The words landed with more force than she expected, because she could hear that he meant them entirely. And because the part of her that had sat on the edge of Leo's bed and watched those small fingers uncurl knew, inconveniently, that he was not entirely wrong. But she also knew that a cage with beautiful curtains and warm bread on the dresser was still, in its essential structure, a cage. She held his gaze. Move away from the door, Louis. He didn't. And in the silence that followed, they both understood that something had just begun. Not the arrangement, not the contract, not the agreement sealed by wire transfer the afternoon before. Something older than all of that. A contest of wills between two people who were, beneath everything, made of the same unyielding material. Neither of them looked away. He moved away from the door, not because she had won. She understood that immediately. He stepped aside with the deliberate calm of a man who had simply decided that this particular battle was not the one that mattered, and that the larger campaign was better served by a tactical retreat. He opened the door himself, held it with one hand, and looked at her with an expression that said, clearly and without words, that he knew she would return, and that the knowing was enough for now. She left. She was back by 4 p.m. She told herself it was because of Leo. That was true, but it was not the complete truth, and she was honest enough with herself, in the quiet of the car she had taken back across the coast road, to acknowledge that the incomplete truth was a thing she would examine later, when the situation was less immediate. The gates opened before she reached them. Someone had been watching. Inside, the house had a different atmosphere than the morning, more populated, more alive with the low current of business being conducted. 2 men she hadn't seen before stood near the entrance to what she assumed was Louis's study, and a small gathering of staff moved through the corridor with the coordinated quiet of people who had learned to be invisible at speed. Someone was speaking in low, rapid tones behind a closed door. The estate, she was beginning to understand, was not simply a home. It was a headquarters, and Louis Rabiot was not simply a man living in it. He was its entire center of gravity. She was halfway across the entrance hall, heading for the staircase, when Louis came through the study door. He saw her immediately. The conversation he had been having with the two men at his shoulder. Large, some watchful men with the particular stillness of people paid to notice everything, paused. He crossed toward her without hurrying, and she stopped because it seemed the natural thing to do, and because something in his direction of travel made stopping feel like the more dignified option. She registered the shift in the room before she understood its cause. The staff who had been moving slowed, or didn't slow, but became aware. The two men behind Louis straightened almost imperceptibly. A housekeeper near the corridor entrance found something to occupy her attention that required her to remain precisely where she was. The room had not stopped, but it had tuned in, quietly, peripherally, the way rooms do when something significant is about to reorganize itself. Louis reached her. He said nothing. He looked at her for one moment with that dark, certain gaze, and then he took her face in both hands, gently, which surprised her, the gentleness of it, and he kissed her. It was not brief. It was not tentative. It was the kind of kiss that made a statement in a language older than words, the kind that didn't ask permission because it had already decided that permission was a formality the moment had moved past. She felt the warmth of it move through her before the surprise did, which told her something about herself she set firmly aside for later examination. When he stepped back, his hands left her face slowly. The room had not changed. Everyone was still doing precisely what they had been doing. But the quality of the silence was different, fuller, more informed, than the silence of people who had received a communication and were processing its implications. She stared at him. "That," she said, keeping her voice very controlled, "was not something you were entitled to do." "No," he agreed, without any apparent remorse. "Then why?" She stopped, because she had already understood why. She had seen it in the men behind him, in the housekeeper, in the way the room had reorganized around the moment with the efficiency of a system updating its records. She understood, with cold clarity, exactly what had just happened and why it had been done here, in this hall, in front of these specific people. He had not kissed her because he was overcome. He had kissed her because he was precise. "You've made me a target," she said quietly. Something crossed his face. Quick. Not quite guilt, but adjacent to it. I've made you untouchable. Those are different things. Not from where I'm standing. He looked at her steadily. In my world, Catherine, the things that belong to me do not get touched. That is not a small distinction. She held his gaze, and the warmth she had firmly set aside refused, inconveniently, to fully dissipate. "I don't belong to you," she said. He said nothing, but the certainty in his silence was, somehow, louder than any answer he could have given. The days settled into a shape she hadn't anticipated. She had expected captivity to feel like captivity, like walls and locked doors, and the specific friction of a life being lived against its will. Instead, it felt, disconcertingly, like something she didn't have a clean word for. The rooms were warm. The grounds were wide enough that walking them in the morning took the better part of an hour. Nobody followed her or monitored her with any visible intrusiveness, and if there were eyes on the perimeter, they faced outward rather than in. She was not imprisoned so much as she was simply present, held in place less by force than by the growing, inconvenient weight of a small boy who had begun to need her in ways that made leaving feel, each morning, slightly less possible than the morning before. Leo was the thing she hadn't calculated. She had understood, in the abstract, that she would care for him. She had not understood how quickly the abstract would become something far more structural. He was 7 years old, and serious in the way children are serious when they have spent too long in adult silence. Watchful, not careful with his words, inclined to observe before participating. But beneath that careful surface was an entire interior world of considerable personality, and it revealed itself in increments, the way spring arrives, almost without your noticing, until one morning, everything is different. By the third day, he was following her to the garden in the mornings, Bo the rabbit tucked under one arm, asking questions that had no particular logical sequence, but enormous earnestness. By the fifth day, he had decided, apparently unilaterally, that she was the appropriate audience for his opinions on which clouds were interesting and which were not. By the end of the first week, he had taken to sitting beside her at every available opportunity with the calm, unsettled confidence of someone who had simply decided that this was now the correct arrangement and saw no reason to discuss it further. She fell in love with him the way you fall into deep water, not all at once, but past a certain point with no meaningful way back. She sang to him every evening, sometimes the familiar melody, sometimes others she found along the way, and sometimes, when he asked, she sang whatever he requested with the utter sincerity of a child who believed that volume and enthusiasm were the primary measures of musical quality. She let him choose the books. She learned that he was frightened of moths, but not of spiders, which he considered sensible and not in need of explanation. She learned that he had his father's habit of complete stillness when something captured his full attention, and his father's directness, and his father's unsettling capacity to look at you as though he was reading something on the inside of your expression that you hadn't intended to make visible. It was through Leo that she began, involuntarily, to see Louis differently. She saw it first in small things, the way Louis appeared at the edge of the garden some mornings, without apparent purpose, watching Leo run between the hedgerows with an expression of such undefended relief that it seemed almost private, as though he hadn't intended to feel it so openly, and hadn't noticed yet that he was. The way he crouched to Leo's level when he spoke to him, always, without exception, as though the height differential was a problem requiring consistent correction. The way he kept his voice measured and low in Leo's presence, his entire register recalibrated, from the authority he wore elsewhere set deliberately aside. She saw it in larger things too. One evening she came down late for water and found Louis sitting outside Leo's closed door in the corridor, his back against the wall, forearms resting on his knees, simply listening to the silence on the other side of it. The good silence, the sleeping silence. He didn't hear her approach, and for a moment before she retreated, she saw him without his architecture. Just a man, sitting on the floor outside his son's door in the dark, grateful in a way he would not have known how to say out loud. She retreated quietly, but the image lodged. The fear she had carried from that first moment in the entrance hall had not disappeared. She was not naive enough to pretend that the man was uncomplicated, or that the world he inhabited was without genuine danger, or that the kiss in the hallway had been anything other than what it was, a calculated act, performed by someone who calculated everything. But calculation, she was learning, was not the whole of him. There was something beneath the control, something that only surfaced in doorways and gardens and corridor floors when he believed no one was watching. Something that looked, in those unguarded slivers, remarkably like devotion. She recognized it because she was beginning to feel it herself, for the boy, certainly, and, with increasing inconvenience, for his father. She heard the dogs first. The estate kept two large, quiet animals who moved through the grounds with the unhurried authority of creatures that understood their purpose and took it seriously. They were not aggressive by temperament. Leo adored them, and they tolerated his affection with patient dignity. But they were alert in the way of animals that had been bred for awareness rather than companionship. Catherine had learned their rhythms over the past 2 weeks, the way you learn any language through immersion, without trying, until comprehension simply arrives. They did not bark like that. Not at this hour. Not at once. She was in the sitting room adjoining Leo's when it began, both animals simultaneously, from opposite ends of the grounds, a sound that was less alarm than declaration. She set down her book and was standing before she had consciously decided to stand, some older instinct moving her body ahead of her reasoning. Then the lights went out. Not gradually. All at once, every room, the grounds plunging from amber warmth into a darkness that was total and immediate, and had clearly been arranged by someone who knew where the primary circuits were. Emergency lighting caught a moment later, low and red-tinted, painting the corridor outside Leo's room in the colors of a threat. She went to Leo first. He was already awake, sitting up in bed with Bo pressed to his chest, and his eyes very wide and very steady, frightened but not panicking, his father's son in this as in most things. "Come here," she said, and her voice was calm because it had to be, and he came to her without hesitation, because he trusted her in the absolute, uncomplicated way of children who have decided. She put him behind her and moved to the corner of the room away from the windows, and she kept one hand on his shoulder and felt him breathe and worked to keep her own breathing even. The door opened. It was Louis, and the version of him that entered the room was not one she had seen before. She had seen him commanding. She had seen him controlled and deliberate and precise. She had seen the unguarded man in the corridor, the relieved father in the garden. This was none of those. This was something older and more elemental. A man stripped of every civil overlay, moving with a focused, terrible efficiency that suggested the world outside the door had already been assessed, and the assessment had not been favorable. He had something in his hand. His eyes went to Leo first, then to her, and what passed across his face in that single moment of confirmation, that they were there, and that they were whole, was so concentrated and so undefended that it struck her somewhere behind her sternum. "Stay in this corner," he said. "Do not move toward the windows. Do not open this door for anyone whose voice you do not know." He looked at Leo. "You stay with Catherine." Leo nodded with a gravity that broke her heart quietly and efficiently. Louis looked at her then, directly, for one long second, and she understood that he was giving her something he did not hand to many people. Not instructions. Trust. The specific trust of a man who needed to move toward the danger and could only do so by believing completely in the person he was leaving behind him. "I'll keep him safe," she said. He held her gaze for a beat that contained more than either of them had yet said out loud. Then he was gone. What followed was 40 minutes she would not fully reassemble into coherent sequence for some time afterward. There were sounds from the grounds, controlled, purposeful sounds, nothing like chaos, which was somehow more frightening than chaos would have been. Leo sat beside her with his back against the wall, and she put her arm around him, and she sang, very quietly, almost below the threshold of hearing. Not for the situation. For him. Because it was the one thing she could do that was entirely within her power, and because his breathing slowed when she did, and because the slowing of his breathing slowed her own. When Louis returned, he was not unscathed. There was a cut above his brow that had been attended to with the cursory efficiency of a man who considered such things administrative rather than significant. He stood in the doorway and looked at them, the boy asleep against Catherine's shoulder, her hand in his hair, her eyes coming up to meet Louis's across the room. He leaned against the doorframe. Something in the set of his shoulders released. "It's over," he said quietly. "Who were they?" she asked, equally quiet. He was silent for a moment. "People who believed that removing you would remove my stability." He paused. They were not wrong about the logic. She absorbed that, the implication of it, that she had become not just a presence in this house, but a strategic vulnerability, a target defined by how much he needed her. settled over her with a weight that was not entirely unwelcome, and that realization unsettled her more than the 40 minutes prior. "They'll try again," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," Louis said, or with a quiet certainty that she believed entirely and chose not to examine too closely. "They won't." He crossed the room and crouched before Leo the way he always did, level, unhurried, and looked at his sleeping son for a long moment with an expression that had no name she could find in any language she spoke. Then he looked at her, and the expression didn't change. It simply expanded. "Thank you," he said. 2 words. Small architecture for what they were carrying. She nodded once and didn't trust herself to say more, and the room held them both in its quiet, as though it understood that some moments required no addition. 3 days passed before she said anything. She needed 3 days to be certain she was acting from clarity rather than from the residue of fear, which could masquerade as conviction convincingly enough to mislead you if you weren't careful. She used the time well. She watched. She thought. She tended to Leo with the same unhurried attentiveness, sang in the evenings, walked the grounds in the mornings, and let the ordinary shape of the days continue uninterrupted while something quietly resolved itself in the deeper architecture of her thinking. On the 4th morning, she did not go to Leo's room after breakfast. She went to Louis's study instead. She knocked once, heard the single word that served as his version of an invitation, and entered. He was at his desk with his reading glasses on. She hadn't known he wore reading glasses, and the detail was humanizing in a way that she noted and set aside. And he looked up with the particular attention he gave to things that arrived unexpectedly. She sat down across from him without being invited to sit. She folded her hands on the edge of his desk and looked at him with the same directness she had used in a rain-soaked shopping mall 2 weeks and an entire lifetime ago. "I want to talk about the arrangement," she said. He removed his glasses. "All right. Since the night of the attack, you've increased the staff presence on my floor. My movements through the house are tracked, not intrusively, but consistently. 3 days ago, you canceled a trip into the village that I mentioned to your housekeeper in passing, a conversation you were not part of, which means someone reported it to you, and you made a decision about my plans without consulting me." She paused. "I am not a territory, Louis. I am not something you secured during the incident, and are now administering." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm keeping you safe." "You are keeping me managed. Those are different things, and I think you know that." Something shifted in his expression, not anger, but the particular stillness of a man who was accustomed to having his decisions received as final and was recalibrating in real time to a conversation that did not operate on that assumption. "The threat hasn't fully resolved," he said. "There are people who—" "I understand the threat." Her voice remained level. "I sat in a dark room with your son for 40 minutes while you dealt with it. I'm not asking you to pretend the danger doesn't exist. I'm telling you that there is a difference between protecting someone and possessing them, and that you have been crossing that line with increasing confidence since the morning you blocked the front door." She held his gaze. "I have let it go on longer than I should have, because Leo needed stability, and because I was finding my own footing. But I know where I stand now." "And where is that?" he asked. His voice was careful in a way she hadn't heard before. "Somewhere that has to be a choice," she said. "Every day, or it means nothing." She let that settle. "I haven't sung in 3 days. Not because I'm punishing Leo. I would never do that. But because Leo has been well enough, and because I needed you to notice." He had noticed, or she could see it in him. The awareness he'd been carrying. The restraint it had cost him not to address it immediately. The way this conversation had perhaps been the one he'd been both expecting and calculating how to avoid. "What do you want?" he asked, directly, without negotiation preamble. I want to be consulted about my own movements, my own schedule, decisions that concern me. I want to be spoken to as someone with a functioning mind and a legitimate perspective on her own life. She paused. I want you to stop looking at me like something you acquired and start looking at me like someone you chose. There is a significant difference, and I believe you are intelligent enough to understand it. The room held the silence for a long moment. Louis set his glasses down with care, leaned back in his chair. Derwin looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen him direct at anything before. Not assessment, not calculation, not the controlled intensity that was his habitual register. Something that was, she thought, closest to recognition. The particular look of someone encountering a thing they had not known they were looking for and finding it in an unexpected form. You are, he said quietly, not like anyone I have encountered. I know, she said without arrogance, simply as a fact that the situation had made relevant. That's why you heard me in that shopping mall. That's why Leo sleeps. She stood. And it's why I'm still here, if you consider it carefully. She walked to the door. Catherine, she turned. He was still watching her with that expression. Tonight, he said. Will you sing to him tonight? It was the closest, on which she understood that he had come to asking rather than assuming. Small movement. But in a man of his particular construction, it was not a small thing. Yes, she said. And she left him there to think about the difference. Something had changed in him after that morning. It was not immediate, and it was not dramatic, and it did not announce itself. It arrived the way the deepest changes do, gradually beneath the surface, the way water finds its way through stone, not by force, but by persistence, until one day the stone is simply different, and you cannot point to the exact moment it became so. She noticed it first in the small things, because the small things always carried the truth before the large ones were ready to. He began leaving the study door open when she passed. Not conspicuously. It could have been coincidence, except that Louis Rabiot did not deal in coincidence. He began appearing at breakfast with Leo rather than taking his coffee alone in his office, and he sat at the table like a man practicing the art of being present rather than strategic, and he listened to Leo's unsequenced morning observations with a patience that was genuine rather than performed. Once, passing her in the corridor with a document in his hand, he paused and asked simply whether she had slept well, and waited for the actual answer rather than moving through the question like a formality. She gave him the actual answer. He seemed, quietly, to receive it as something significant. The consultation began, haltingly at first, with the slight stiffness of a man speaking a language he had learned late, but with increasing fluency. He asked before adjustments were made to her schedule. He told her, rather than arranged, when security protocols would affect her movement, and explained the reasons with the directness of someone addressing an equal rather than managing a dependent. It wasn't effortless. She could see the effort, which was, she thought, more honest than effortlessness would have been. 3 weeks after the morning in his study, he came to find her in the garden. Leo was indoors with his tutor. The afternoon was clear and cool, the kind of light that made everything precise and unhurried. She was sitting on the low stone wall at the garden's edge, reading, when she heard him approach. Unhurried. No security presence, which was unusual enough to make her look up. He sat down beside her, not across from her. Beside her. The wall was narrow, and the proximity was immediate, and he settled into it without the controlling forward energy she had come to associate with his nearness. He sat the way a man sits when he has come without an agenda, which was so unlike him that she closed her book. He looked at the garden for a while. She let him. "I've been thinking," he said finally, "about what you said. About choice." A pause. "About what I have been building here, and whether what I am building is something worth having, or simply something worth holding. He turned to look at her then, and his face was without its architecture. No command, no calculation, nothing managed or curated. Just the face of a man who had arrived, through considerable interior distance, at something true. No, I've been running an empire that I inherited through blood, and that I have sustained through the same means. I told myself it was for Leo, that I was building a legacy. He stopped. But a legacy built on the foundations I have laid is not a gift. It is a sentence, and I have been too proud, for too long, to admit the difference. She was very still. I have spoken to people, he continued, people who can facilitate a transition. It will take time. It is not simple, and it will not be without cost to me, significant cost. But it is possible. He paused. I want it to be possible. The garden held its quiet around them. Why now? She asked. He looked at her steadily. Because I cannot ask you to build a life in a structure that is designed to eventually collapse. And because Leo deserves a father who dismantles dangerous things rather than inherits them. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced something small and set it on the wall between them. A ring. Simple and extraordinary. A single dark stone that caught the afternoon light with quiet intensity. He did not pick it up. He left it there, between them, as though the space between them was where the decision lived. I am not commanding this, he said. I want to be clear about that. I am asking. She looked at the ring. At him. At the man who had met her in a shopping mall and transferred half a life-changing sum before learning her name, who had blocked doors and kissed her in front of his men and sat on corridor floors in the dark, who had also, when asked, learned the difference. The transition, she said carefully, saw you would do this regardless, not as a transaction. Regardless, he confirmed, it is the right thing. It should not require a reward. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached out and picked up the ring from the wall between them and held it in her palm and felt the weight of it, modest and absolute. Ask me properly, she said. And Louis Rabiot, the man whose name made dangerous men speak quietly, looked at the woman beside him on a garden wall in the clear afternoon light and asked, without command, without certainty of outcome, just a man asking. A year has a particular weight when it has been lived fully. Catherine understood this in the way you understand things that have moved through your body rather than simply your mind. Not as an idea, but as a physical fact. Something she could feel in the difference between the woman who had stood beside a flower stall in a rain-soaked mall with a near-empty donation tin at her feet, and the woman she was now, standing at the tall window of the estate's eastern sitting room, with one hand resting, almost without thinking, against the gentle curve of her abdomen. The morning was clear. Below the window, the garden was bright with the particular quality of light that belongs to early autumn. Warm but precise, the kind that makes edges sharp and colors honest. And in the garden, moving between the hedgerows with the loose, unguarded energy of a child who had remembered how to simply be a child, was Leo. She watched him run. That was still the thing that undid her most reliably, even now. The running. The careless, purposeless, glorious running of a boy with somewhere to be, and no particular reason to be there, except that his legs were working, and the morning was available. And life, it turned out, was something he had decided to participate in fully. He had grown 3 centimeters since spring. His face had filled out, lost its pallor, acquired the particular brightness of a child who was sleeping well and eating without negotiation, and had opinions about things that mattered to no one but himself, expressed with considerable passion. He slept every night, soundly, fully, with Bo the rabbit in the crook of his arm and the stars on his ceiling doing their quiet, golden work overhead. Catherine still sang to him, not because he required it anymore, but because they had both come to understand that it was not only about the sleeping, it was about the ritual of it, the nightly confirmation that the day had been survived, and the night was safe, and the morning would come, and that she would be there when it did. Some things, once they become structural to a life, simply remain. You don't dismantle what is holding something up simply because the emergency has passed. Behind her, the door opened. She knew his step without turning. She had learned it the way you learn all the things that become yours. Gradually, then completely. Louis came to stand beside her at the window, and he looked at his son in the garden below with the expression she had come to know as his most honest one, the one reserved for moments when he forgot to maintain the distance he had once believed was necessary between feeling things and showing that you felt them. He had been forgetting more frequently. She considered this one of her finer achievements. His hand found hers. "He has a football now," Louis said, observing Leo's recent acquisition with the gravity of a man making a significant report. "He asked me for it on Tuesday," Catherine said. "I told him to ask you." Louis glanced at her. "He told me you said it was fine." She smiled at the window. "He's negotiating. You should be proud." Something moved through Louis's expression that was equal parts exasperation and absolute delight, and he said nothing, though because there was nothing useful to say, and also because Leo had just attempted a move of considerable ambition and no technical merit that sent him tumbling into the grass, from which he emerged immediately, undiscouraged, to try again. The Rabiot name had not disappeared from conversations over the past year. Names like that do not simply vanish. They transition, if the hands steering them are patient, and the intention behind the transition is genuine, which Louis's had been in ways that had cost him considerably, and that he had not once, to her knowledge, complained about. The process was not complete, and it was not uncomplicated, and there were people who remained skeptical of a man who had operated as Louis had operated, suddenly electing legitimacy. Catherine understood their skepticism. She also understood, better than anyone, the difference between a performance and a reckoning, and what she had watched Louis move through over 12 months was the latter, undertaken with the same focused intensity he brought to everything, directed now toward construction rather than control. The foundations they were building were slow and unglamorous, and would take years more to be fully realized. She thought they would hold. She felt the small movement beneath her hand at her abdomen, flutter soft, barely perceptible, the private communication of a life in its earliest stages of announcing itself. And she was quiet with it for a moment, holding the knowledge warmly. Louis felt the change in her stillness. He looked at her. "All right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Then because the morning was clear, and the boy was in the garden, and the word felt accurate in every direction she pointed it. "Very." He looked at her for a long moment, with the expression she had first seen on a corridor floor outside a sleeping child's door. Unguarded, unarchitected, the face of a man in the presence of the one thing that had never required him to be anything other than what he was. Then he looked back at Leo, who had mastered neither the football nor the art of remaining upright, but was trying with magnificent persistence, and the three of them existed together in the morning light. The boy in the garden, the woman at the window, the man beside her with his hand covering hers, occupying quietly and completely the life they had built from the most unlikely of materials. A transfer, a melody, a door that didn't open when it should have. A wolf who had learned in the end that the bravest thing he had ever done was not the conquering, it was the kneeling.